Hello, and welcome to the Left Crew Politics Podcast. I'm your host for this episode, Jeremy Gruhlkey. I'm joined today by my guest, Levi Baileyn, who we'll introduce in a minute. Rick and Michael will be back with me sometime, hopefully later next week, talking a little bit more about the Trump impeachment, see what's going on with that. So if you're looking forward to our points of view on that whole boondoggle, you'll be able to get those coming up soon. But today we're going to talk a little bit about libertarianism versus progressivism and sort of the differences in those ideologies and how they apply to governance. And we're going to talk a little bit about this developing over the last few years rivalry between Texas and California and which state does things better and where it's a better spot to live and what's the better form of governments and all of that stuff. So we've got a broad-ranging show today. I'd like to introduce my guest. His name is Levi Baileyn. He's another Texas to California transplant. He's been here almost 20 years. How you doing, Levi?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on libertarianism. And you actually ran for office here in California last year as a libertarian, didn't you?
That is correct. I ran for state assembly last year for California and got the endorsement of the Libertarian Party at the time.
Wow.
Which it really was one of those stories where I just kept complaining about our local rep, and was because the guy consistently runs with no competition year after year, but he still raises like $1 million every election cycle. And I'm like, someone Democrat, correct. Right. And I was like, why is no one standing up to this guy? He doesn't put out anything for our district even. He's more concerned. He's of the ilk that his big accomplishment was getting SeaWorld to Free Willy, so to speak.
Like they actually sent him back to the ocean?
They did send him back to the ocean. I think they just were like, okay, they passed a law saying they can't get any new like killer whales.
Right.
But that's the culmination of his 10 years in the state assembly.
It's not a lot of accomplishments, I'll agree.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, it's one of those things that, as we'll get into later, see in a lot of ways kind of a downward trend around us in LA and California. And watching that happen and seeing no real representation in government, I was like, okay, I guess I'll try to be that guy that actually runs against him.
Right.
And
what was that process like? I mean, you and I've talked a little bit about it in the past, but what was it like to actually get on the ballot and go through the whole system and do the campaigning?
So it was kind of interesting to see the Brazil-like bureaucracy, like in person. Because as far as the paperwork goes, is literally to the point, the LA County, I'm trying to think of what's even called, but like, where you just go do all the paperwork, the LA County Registrar.
The registrar.
It's like a 6 or 8 floor building in far east LA County, which is about 2.5 hours away from LA proper.
Right.
But it's to the point where you're literally show up to a window on floor 4 and like, oh, okay, so here's pages 5 and 7. You're going to have to get page 6 from the 6th floor. And then you're going to have to bring that back down here. We'll stamp it. And then once you get that stamp, go to the 7th floor.
Right.
So it's like you spend all day just going from floor to floor.
I'm sure that really inflamed your libertarian sensibilities of an officious bureaucrary.
Yeah. The whole time I was like, this is why I'm doing this.
Right.
But it was, that said, everyone was incredibly nice during the process.
Sure.
And I think it helped that I was very nice too, because everyone else they were dealing with was constantly just losing their shit over the situation.
Right.
Being like, what? Why do I have to go up there and go down here? But anyways, the whole process was a lot of those type of steps where it seems like you're doing repeat work. And
right.
I understand why there's people that make a living just basically doing all this mundane work for different candidates.
Right.
So that is like just part of it. And then the other huge part for me was finding out what I believe in, because you
you had to really think through the issues in order to be able to express them to the people that you would hope would vote for you.
Yeah, exactly. Because we all like bitch and moan about whatever's going on, and then had to sit back and be like, okay,
what's the solution?
Yeah.
Right. What's actually practicable?
Yeah. And even then is still like reading lots of studies and doing what you can just to be able to have cohesive, intelligent talking points on these issues.
Because we all think that we know what's going on and we get upset about it, or we post a rant on Facebook, or we bitch to our friends. But then when it actually comes time to really discussing the nuances of the issues, they become a lot more complex than what you think that those things are really about. And you have to think around the hurdles and the complications and the what ifs and all of that. And it becomes, that's where bureaucracy ultimately comes from, is you institute this solution, and then that creates another challenge, and then you have to make another solution to solve the problem that was caused by that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I can totally get the frustration with that sort of a bureaucracy. So how did you feel about, in the end, what your ultimate goal was to set out to actually challenge the person who's currently representing our district to actually have to say and do something in defense of his position, right? Do you feel like you were able to actually do that?
No, I pretty much tripped at the starting block as far as that whole thing went. It
was your first time as a candidate, right?
Yeah. And that said, I'm going to take what I learned there and approach, I think, city council this next go around. Just because that's a whole other can of worms. But basically from the get go, it's incredibly low standards to actually like get onto ballots.
Right. You just need a certain number of signatures.
Yeah. So I definitely encourage anyone at home, if you're like me and just like constantly complaining,
right,
just look into it. You don't be like, oh, this is actually any Yahoo with some time could probably get on the ballot.
Right.
That said, I needed like 40 signatures, pretty low total.
40.
40 of registered people in my district to get onto the ballot. I turned in just about 90 signatures about a week ahead of time.
Because some of them, they double check those signatures and then they might exclude some. So you need a buffer, right?
Yeah. So I was like, okay, 90, that should be fine. Get me on there. And then they ended up calling me the due date. I can't remember exactly. Let's say it was like the 26th of September or something. And they close at 5 p.m. They called me at 4 p.m. on the 26th of September and said, oh, you actually only have like 20 signatures that qualify. I was like, wow, really? Is that like that high of a like failure rate?
Right.
Fortunately, at that point, I was keeping a spreadsheet as well that had all the people on it, where they're registered.
Way more organized than I would have been.
Yeah.
Which probably a good reason I don't run for office.
So at that point, I was like, okay, well, if I can get more signatures in the next hour, can I fax it over or something and they're like, oh no, you got to like deliver them to us right now in person. I was like, well, you're over 2 hours away and you called me an hour before the deadline. So eventually I went through their hierarchy there and got kind of a manager to like recount. Yeah. Well, no, they wouldn't give me an extension. They just did a recount. And they came back 5 minutes later and were like, actually, you had 32 signatures that qualified. I was like, well, now I trust you guys even less on this.
Right. That's an over 50% discount rate.
Yeah. That's beyond any like portion of error.
Right.
That's acceptable. So yeah, and then I sent over my spreadsheet showing what I had and people registered and going off what was supposed to be the official county registrar registration records.
Right.
So it's pretty thorough and detailed. And then after that day, they just like stopped taking my calls and just would insta hang up when they get me on the line and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But anyways, I think my big takeaway with that is like, I don't think there's any like malevolent force there. I think it's purely just like they have quotas and they're just trying to get through the day,
right?
And just trying to get through everything as quickly as possible,
right? Most civil servants aren't really attracted to the idea of civic responsibility necessarily, right? They're just executing a function, stamping a page and moving you on to the next window.
It's like any other job, right? But so I think my big takeaway is on that front is just completely nuking it next go around and like leaving no room for any
turning 400 signatures. And maybe 1 in 10 will qualify.
Exactly right.
Right. That's interesting. I should also mention it's about 3:30 in the afternoon on a Saturday, and this I think is a first for the LCP Politics podcast, in that Levi and I are actually sitting in the same room. Usually we're in disparate parts of the country and communicating via phone. So we're actually having a nice face-to-face conversation here. We're both enjoying a glass of bourbon, and we're just going to have a little bit of fun talking about the differences in our ideologies and our experiences as transplants from red states into a blue state. So you're also a writer here in Hollywood, right?
That is correct.
A comedy writer.
My Emmy, I like to say that.
My Emmy, right?
My Emmy. Now, my Emmy was for like best comedic short, something called First Dates. But the thing that actually has been paying my money is more supernatural. So I do lots of video game writing, TV writing.
Video game writing, like the narratives for video game?
Correct. So like Evil Within and Destiny.
Are these popular video games? I don't know because I don't play.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's kind of funny. Like for people in the video game world, you'll say that and they're like, oh, wow, that's really cool because like Destiny grossed over $1 billion.
Right.
The like first day it went on sale.
And you're like, I didn't see any of that.
Yeah, exactly.
that doesn't flow through to me.
Yeah. Exactly right. So those I've worked on some pretty big video games, but yeah, like you said, the WGA, the Writers Guild, doesn't care about those so much.
Right.
So video games are still able to pay people peanuts, and there's always yahoos like me that will work for those peanuts.
Right. And recently you've been working on a show called Day 5. Is that what it's called?
Correct. Day 5. It's bounced on a couple different networks now, but it came out of, speaking of Texas, Austin-based Rooster Teeth.
You actually went back to Texas to work in the writing room.
Yeah, right. Lived. It's a pretty cool experience. They just rented out a house for all the writers that were from LA and New York. So it's like a crazy dorm type situation with all of us living together 24/7 pretty much. And that was like a 3-month period.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And you've done a couple of seasons of that show, right?
Yeah, we did 2, and we'll see if season 3 happens. It's probably going to happen with a different network. Maybe, I guess I can't really talk about that too much, but yeah, fingers crossed that season 3 will happen with a bigger network.
And it's sort of I don't know if sci-fi, but post-apocalyptic kind of.
Yeah, the base concept with that, which is kind of fun, is basically one day everyone that falls asleep dies instantly. Something happens and going to sleep kills you. And it's called Day 5 because it takes place 5 days into this sleep apocalypse. And the lead hero in this story is basically a junkie that
he's been awake for 5 days.
Yeah, he was awake for 3 days and didn't even realize
but all these people are dying around him.
Yeah.
Right.
And then in this world, he's kind of a superhero because he's used to just doing speed and staying up for
weeks at a time without actual sleep.
Yeah.
Right.
So he's the chosen one, so to speak, in this world. And we kind of follow him along as they try to figure out what's happened.
Cool. And where can people find the first 2 seasons?
I believe you could still purchase them through Rooster Teeth. You can purchase the DVDs through roosterteeth.com. And I believe they're on streaming through the El Rey network. If you have the El Rey network on your cable package, but Univision owns them and they've been fighting the cable companies for the last year or two. So it's hit or miss if you actually have El Rey.
Yeah, I don't even have cable anymore. I do streaming Hulu is what I use. So
yeah,
I was like, I'm cutting the cord. They were taking way too much of my money.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that I don't know if you follow like piracy at all, but
right, illegal downloads and stuff.
Yeah, but with Netflix for a while there, piracy actually slowed down immensely because you could pretty much go to Netflix and Hulu and get almost all the content you actually want to watch as a person.
Right. And even if you created content, it's one more place to get it on.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But recently, in the last 2 years or so, piracy is seeing like a second like golden age, maybe a silver age, because like obviously Disney is doing their own thing now, and they've taken back a lot of their content. Apple, all the individual networks have their own streaming platforms now.
Right. It's a pain in the ass.
So and it's nice in some ways because you can cobble together what you actually care about.
Right. But you have a bunch of little piddly ass $6 a month subscriptions.
Exactly.
And you might want to watch, like I would love to watch the new Star Trek show on CBS All Access.
Yeah.
I've heard it's amazing and I'm a huge Star Trek fan, but
really?
I don't need one more subscription just to watch that one show. You know what I mean? And there's probably other things on there that I would watch, but I've got so much content. Like I turn on Netflix or Amazon Prime and I just go into a mild trance trying to find something, just constantly flipping from one thing to the next. And it's almost impossible to land on something and decide what to watch.
But yeah, so that's why piracy is booming again, because there's so many shows that people are like, oh, I really want to watch this, but I would literally be paying $6 a month for this one show, which
seems a fair price, to be honest.
Yeah,
right, but
to watch a show that costs several $1 million per episode to make, that's definitely fair.
And employs several thousand people.
Yeah,
yeah, totally.
But from the perspective of Johnny Pirate at home, it's just like, I'll just
I can just press this button and watch it for free.
Yeah.
So. That's interesting. All right, so I want to get into a little bit of the actual political content for our political podcast. You and I are both Cowboys fans, so I want to talk about that a little bit later as well.
And we're apparently both Trekkies.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. I'm definitely next generation.
Through and through.
Yeah, totally. Picard all the way. But I wanted to give you a chance to start by explaining your attraction to libertarianism and what you see as the value of that and why it's something that you think could do more positive things for the country than where we currently are. Yeah,
so for the most part, I feel like I was definitely an anarchist growing up. And I think we're
totally anti-government, anti-organization of all kind.
Yeah, obviously that's
not practical.
Not practical.
Right.
But when you're youthful, you don't have to be practical.
Right.
So I was definitely, and where that really stemmed from is a general fear of power, like people having power over other people.
Right.
And then as I got older, the way that matured was understanding that what I really wanted is to minimize the power that government has over the way people can live their lives.
Right.
And that's how libertarianism as an idea really appealed to me. Sorry, go ahead.
So are you you're interested in the most limited form of government possible?
Yeah, so I'd say that's attractive, but so that's where I'd also say I'm also, though, where I differ in some libertarians that it doesn't matter how people will have power, as they'll have power in private corporations and use that as well to just abuse people.
Sure.
So I'm not really a libertarian purist in that sense.
So you don't think the market can handle and solve all problems?
I think there are definitely problems it can solve as long as there's some sort of competition that's innate to whatever is in that market.
Right.
But yeah, there's definitely things where the government has to step in and stand up against monopolies, and there has to be some sort of like mixed government there that I recognize. And also the other big knock on like pure libertarianism that is, it doesn't answer that question of what happens with inequality.
Right.
And the answer usually is at a certain point, the guillotines come out.
Right.
Historically speaking.
But it's not really fair for the people before the guillotines come out, though. You have long periods of time where,
yeah, exactly.
Of oppression, basically.
Yeah. So that's why I've also been interested in like kind of the more Milton Friedman, like either negative income tax, he used to call it, or some form of UBI, which is also caught on in the mainstream. Like,
really, I hadn't thought of UBI. You're talking about universal basic income.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that as a libertarian ideal.
Yeah. And it seems counterintuitive, right?
I guess from a standpoint of if everybody's on a level playing field with income, then the market works in a better way.
Yeah.
And because so many corporations, I'm just thinking through your own ideas for you. If the corporations have all of the money and they're trending towards more profits with less labor, then there has to be some sort of leveling effect that makes the markets effective again. And so from that standpoint, a UBI would be attractive to certain libertarian ideals.
Yeah. And it, again, Milton Friedman, I think, called it like a negative income tax, but is pretty similar of one. It's pumping money into the economy by allowing people to have actual purchasing power. It's allowing, and that's like the key libertarian idea that like economic freedom is priority number one, because that's how you, in this modern age, you can actually be free, is having as much economic freedom as possible. And the other things with him was also replacing, and this is where it gets, when I have these conversations, normally it immediately gets pushed back, but I know they wanted to replace a lot of the quote-unquote welfare state with some sort of UBI, so to have less of kind of a father state telling you, okay, here's your allowance to use on food, here's your allowance to use on this, right, and just giving you
a flat amount every month.
Yeah, and leaving it up to you to actually figure out how to live your life with it.
Right.
So that, and again, Milton Friedman, and I feel like anytime with libertarians on a podcast, you can like do a drinking game around how many times he mentions Friedman. But the other thing there that he was aware of, like inequality as a thing, and like the eventual negative side effects for whatever system you've created, beyond like the initial suffering of people, but
right,
that eventually people are going to get a little pissed off that they have so little when others have so much.
Right.
Yeah.
So within your personal libertarian philosophy, you see room for government to have certain roles, but not necessarily all the roles that they presently have. Like there's an effective way for government to insert itself in the functioning of a society, if not an individual's life, right? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like again, anywhere I can see a reasonable argument to allow people to have more freedom, I'm innately drawn towards that.
Right. And you think that starts with economic freedom? Yeah,
that's. I think it's definitely a key component.
I think that's interesting. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily call economic freedom the prima facie form of freedom, but I think that I definitely agree having as much economic freedom as possible is good. I just wonder about those circumstances where the market actually robs people of economic freedom because of dominance or required participation in things such as, healthcare or education and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So for me I want to let you finish, but there are definitely areas where, there's a lot that's attractive about the libertarian philosophy to me personally.
Yeah.
That at one time when I was really young, I used to call myself a libertarian.
Yeah.
Because I just, was about the power of the individual making personal choices. But then as I got older, some things sort of changed, which I'll talk about when I talk about my own journey here in a minute. But, so what about your stance on regulation as a whole? Are you generally like, we have too much regulation, or?
So it's funny you bring that up. I think regulation is almost like a trigger word in political discussions.
For a lot of people, yeah.
Because like when I mention regulation to someone on the left, it's like immediately like, oh, so you hate the environment? You want to make it so oil companies can just like go full Captain Planet supervillain on stuff?
Right.
And then you mentioned it to
people.
You
do, obviously.
I mean, first, yes. Every episode I was like, oh, they're going to get this Captain Planet this time.
Right,
yeah. A huge fan of the guy that had the pig face that worked for like Big Oil and Captain Planet.
Right. Yeah.
And then you mentioned it, people on the right, and they're like, oh, the government's going to like spend billions a year to protect a canary.
Right.
Yeah.
They're going to tell me how to live my life.
Yeah. So,
which is not the goal, obviously. I like those canaries, to be honest with you. I want to.
Yeah. But so generally I'm so on a base level, what can happen with regulation is, it's slapping a Band-Aid on something, or like putting your finger in the dam, and then another hole pops up and you get more and more. But it really is, every time I look at an issue, I have to look at like what regulations are in place and why.
Right.
Because the other thing
because they didn't just come out of nowhere. Somebody didn't just pull them out of their ass. There was a reason that regulation was instituted. And it might not have been as well thought out as it should have been.
And this is one of those issues with a mixed economy like we do have, is sometimes regulations are obviously put in place essentially by private corporations that were like, hey, this would help
to benefit them.
Yeah. So that's like another thing, is that regulations are being put in place by private corporations to stifle the free market. So it's, I'm not like a blanket ideologist on regulations, but I'm always, I think my gut instinct is actually, when one comes about, just always saying like, okay, is this actually going to solve more problems than it creates?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know where you come from on that.
Right. No, I think that, I've gotten more progressive as I've gotten older, which is the opposite of the way things generally trend.
Yeah.
Especially for somebody coming from Texas. I think that some of it is having been exposed to more progressive ideas and a more liberal democracy in California than I was in Amarillo, Texas as a teenager and in my 20s. But also I think that it's just that in California, I was able to more connect with and express the progressive ideas that I'd always felt. Whereas in Texas, those things were somewhat stifled.
Yeah.
I don't know. You came to Texas a lot, or from Texas to California a lot earlier than I did in your teens, but I didn't come until I was in my late 20s. I was 29.
Okay.
And I think that one of the first things I noticed is that the standard of thought, what's accepted in California, or in Texas rather, is much more homogenous than it is in California. You're much more expected to toe the line, and you're considered weird and an outlier and almost castigated for differing from the very conservative party. Like if I said, well, maybe everybody shouldn't have an AK-47, that would be a really taboo subject to bring up at the Buffalo
Wild State.
Right. That'd be a really taboo subject at the Buffalo Wild Wings watching the Cowboys game on a Sunday afternoon. It would not go over well.
Yeah.
But here there are open discussions about what's the value of people being allowed to own these things versus being them being regulated or restricted. And I don't want to get off into the tangent of gun control necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about that a little bit when we talk about the differences between Texas and California.
Yeah.
But I just feel like California is to me, it's a more open-minded place. It's definitely a very progressive and mostly left-wing place, but it's, if you get outside of Los Angeles and West Hollywood and those sorts of things, you get into some very red areas. And there's those people in Los Angeles who have come here from all over the country. And so there's a much bigger melting pot of ideas than what I was getting in Amarillo or Dallas. And I've really been attracted to that.
Piggyback on that. I came out to Riverside, California originally, which is a very red area. And, actually some of the few libertarians, by that I should say people from the Libertarian Party that are in, California government or out in what they call the Inland Empire, but Riverside, San Bernardino.
Right.
And I think you're right in definitely some ways where I'll say there's definitely, especially the last couple of years, there's been some very angry people if you're not towing the ideological line, at least in
California.
California, I mean,
it's gotten a little more to that side. I will admit that. Yeah.
I'd say Hollywood is obviously even more like a super bubble to the point where, I gave up social media altogether 2 years ago. Pretty much.
You're smarter than me. I'm still scrolling it for about 3 hours a day.
It got to the point where I'd stopped commenting on there before that, but I was still making the mistake of liking things. And
that shows up in people's
feeds. And then I got a talking to for my reps where they're for my reps and from some other people I know in the industry, they're hey, you're liking some stuff that
really,
they're
interesting.
They're you need to take that down, because if people see that, they might think you're a Trump supporter or you're a Nazi or whatever it is. And there's nothing from my point of view, nothing like that at all. Is usually stuff from comedians complaining about whatever comedians complain about, but so that is the first time that I got what seems like a very small thing to me is still grounds for hey,
an indicator to somebody else.
Yeah, it's like a dog whistle of sorts, to use that term that's used to death these days.
Yeah. Dog whistles are used to death.
Yeah. But again, I'm in an even more crazy microcosm of Hollywood,
right?
Where people are inherently putting on a show and projecting an image,
right? And
part of that image is just who you're connected to and who you're around. So it makes sense that
attracts like. And it's interesting.
So in that sense, I'm always dead silent when I go to those parties. In terms of once politics comes up.
Sure.
I'm just ha ha ha, you are correct.
I think that obviously I don't have any frame of reference for what it's like within the entertainment industry and that whole milieu. I think that definitely what you're saying about people becoming more adamant about the left side of the line and less tolerant of the other side of the line has definitely increased in my circle of friends and in the people that I interact with over the last, 8 or 10 years. I think that part of that is is a reaction to things on the right having gone so crazy in so many different ways to where, and it's like people want to rebel against and push back against what they see from that side as genuine racism and jingoism and, defamation of immigrants or, transgender people or gay people who are all, our friends here in Hollywood. So you hear that sort of stuff and you don't want to be associated with it in any way. And so there's a natural overreaction to then push back against anybody who expresses any view that is sympathetic with those people on that side. So I think that has definitely happened. But I think that sort of relates to the way that our politics has evolved as a whole in the country and the way the civil discourse has genuinely declined as less than what the culture is in California or what the culture is necessarily in red states. I think for me, I'm attracted to progressivism because I'm attracted to the idea of the organization of a more inclusive and a more capable society as a whole, as opposed to just a loose collection of individuals all doing what they want and society somewhat becoming sort of a sum of disparate parts. I believe, you talked about earlier about wanting to protect people from the institutions of power or limit the power that government has, I think is what you said. I see progressivism as a form of protecting people from power. Because power can be very overwhelming and you need the whole caveat emptor and buyer beware and all of that sort of stuff. It doesn't apply anymore in our society because no one person can be as informed as they need to be about everything that actually impacts their daily life to actually have a say in it. You know what I mean? Like we need a set of regulations that protects us from predatory lending and from corporations who would put whatever they want in their food. Like it's not enough to me to say that the market will work all that out because if enough people die eating that peanut butter, they just won't eat that peanut butter anymore. You know what I mean? We need a set of systems in place that protect us from those things. And progressivism, liberalism early on and progressivism, which now is apparently two different things, which I'd like to talk a little bit in a minute about what's happened with the progressive movement and the way that it's been corrupted by certain ideas. But, to me, progressivism is about an inclusive society that protects those without power from those who have the power. And free markets, in my opinion, don't do that. And in the first place, I don't believe in a free market. Not that I as an idea. But I think that it's impossible for it to exist. Every market is manipulated by some set of factors, and most markets are manipulated by those with the most money and most power at any given time. The idea that the consumers in a market really have all that much power is not something that I would suggest actually exists. But I would say that I'm not currently progressivism has gone in a direction that I'm not entirely always comfortable with. We have progressives who are trying to solve problems that don't need to be solved for people that don't want you to solve them for them. They're constantly looking to be outraged on behalf of somebody else and then institute rules and regulations that aren't, like we talked about earlier, always completely thought out, and they don't really help the people that they're trying to help, and they actually hinder the industries that those regulations are being applied to. That doesn't mean the regulations aren't well-meaning or that the idea behind them isn't well-meaning, but it just doesn't always work as we want it to work. And I also think that in the last, really, I guess what's it been now, about 4 years, there's a whole wing of the progressive movement that has decided that an abject and absolute support for whatever comes out of Bernie Sanders' mouth is a litmus test for whether or not you're a true progressive. There are people online all the time telling me I'm not a true progressive because I don't just automatically assume that everything Bernie Sanders says is right. And I voted for Bernie Sanders in the California primary in 2016.
I voted for him in the primary too.
Did you? That's pretty funny.
I switched
parties into the Democratic Party.
Just long enough to.
Did you go NPP or Democratic Party?
I think I went NPP on that one. Yeah.
Right. Because in California, you can vote in the Democratic primary if you're registered as a no party preference. Mm-hmm. But to vote in the Republican primary, you have to be registered as a California Republican. Yeah. So as an NPP, you could vote in the Democrat. That's what I'm registered as, by the way, as an NPP. But like, for instance, I like Medicare for all. I like the idea of Medicare for all because I like the idea of equal access to healthcare for everybody. That's where power comes from, is when everybody has equal access. Yeah. But if you don't just automatically, abjectly say, I'm going to accept Medicare for all without any debate or suggestion that something should be different, even though you accept and agree with all of the same ideals for what Medicare for all is supposed to address. And it's those ideas that are progressive. It's not the bill itself that's progressive. It's trying to address progressive ideals. Yeah. But if you're not an immediate and complete supporter of everything that Bernie Sanders says, then you're not a quote unquote real progressive. And, we got into a situation where people were saying things like Hillary is just as bad. And now some of those people are calling, Elizabeth Warren basically a Republican, which is flat out ridiculous.
Right now, libertarians are really enjoying like the monkey knife fight that is like the Democratic primary. Yeah.
Well, primaries are always that way to a certain extent.
Yeah. Just last time you had, Trump just bashing.
Right. A whole clown car of Republicans coming out and nobody able to, why the party was attracted. And this is something that I don't know how much I want to get into this, but Trump was the ultimate and inevitable result of the way the Republicans managed their base over the last 30 years. Yeah. They inoculated them against facts and science in a lot of ways, and just everything became about owning the libs and whatever the liberals say is wrong. Yeah. And they created a base that wasn't prepared or ready to think about the issues in a way that the Republicans in the primary actually wanted to discuss those issues.
Exactly.
And so Trump was just like that to the nth degree, and everybody was like, fuck it, tear it all down. Nothing that we voted for in the past 30 years has worked for us. Yeah. Let's vote for this asshole and maybe it will be fine.
So that's the thing that, is if you create straw men constantly. Right. Which was a lot of what the Republicans were doing,
still doing. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit when we talk about Texas v. California. But.
And honestly, what I see a lot of like Democrats doing now too, but if you're constantly creating straw men and making your base okay with that, just being okay with this caricature of your opponent and attributing all their problems to that, then you really shouldn't be surprised once you become one of those straw men to them.
Because now the party they've been doing it for 30 years. Yeah. So the party is full of and even led by these true believers who came up in that narrative, and they believe that narrative. They're attached to it almost like a religion. And so anything that differs from that narrative, the Jim Jordans of the world and the Ted Cruzes and whatever. Ted Cruz is maybe the biggest asshole in the history of American politics, but
you say that, but you forget like the 19th century was mostly assholes.
Okay. Rich, white, landowning assholes who,
I enjoy whenever you see those like smear pieces from like the 19th century where they'll just flat out say like, my opponent like screws his sister and just like crazy stuff like that. You're like, I guess our discourse isn't that bad.
It's not that bad. And it's not as bad as Parliament now, for sure.
Oh my God.
I mean, we could do a whole show on Brexit. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that whole thing is just
controversial.
A mess. Yeah.
Controversial thoughts, I assure you.
So, I mean, I guess to just circle back to the attraction to progressivism for me is that I think that the modern Republican Party and libertarians as a whole see our society as nothing more than a market. You know, and I don't see our society. We're more than a market, and we're more than an economy. Mm-hmm. We are a society and a culture and a peoples, and it's important that everybody within that society have an equal footing, and we need a structured system in place that assures that equal footing, because right now we don't have it. And without that structured system, human beings are incredibly flawed, and our biases tend us towards oppression. And that is going to happen whether or not you're talking about a market or governance. It's just, you're going to end up with different classes of people. And right now, we let our markets determine who's in which class. And unfortunately, those lower end classes, the further you go towards the bottom of the class system, the browner it gets. And that's unfortunate. And so to me, progressivism is a sort of a way to address that and move towards a more just and equal society where people have an equal access to power, and people are treated by power equally.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think this is probably going to touch on a little bit of what I think you're hinting at there, is where liberals and progressives have kind of become two separate things based on where you're at on the internet. But I think part of it is that idea that there are hierarchies and like all different aspects of individuals, groups, society. And I think the thing, especially the last couple of years, where you're seeing people that are coming out as like Western liberals instead of progressives.
The John Hickenloopers and the guy from Montana who's not ever going to be president. Steve Bullock. Yeah. That guy just comes off as an asshole.
And like in a lot of the internet YouTube personalities that are like popular the last couple of years that came out of like Gamergate and whatnot, but they all like identify themselves as like Western liberals. And a lot of where that's coming at is they used to is this idea that they want people to have freedom, and they're very pro like the rights of minorities, but what they're afraid of is with too much interference, what you're trying to guarantee is that equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity.
Yeah, in some aspects, that's socialism, not progressivism, though.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess I'd be kind of curious where you, not to dictate what happens on your own podcast, but
no, it's an open conversation.
I'd be curious to know where you see, because the difference between progressivism and socialism in like a broad stroke, where they diverge. Because I know when we talk about those straw man arguments,
right?
Like especially anyone I know that's would call themselves Republicans see those two things as one and the same.
One and the same, yeah.
And honestly, lots of people I know in the like libertarian community also see them as like one and the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's absolutely true. If Bernie Sanders is the nominee, the Republican Party is going to campaign angrily and avidly against the radical leftist socialism from the Democrats.
Yeah, he spent his honeymoon in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. If Joe Biden is the nominee, the Republican Party is going to campaign angrily and avidly against the radical leftist socialism of the Democratic Party. It doesn't matter whether the candidate is Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. They're going to call it radical leftist socialism, right? And it's not. Now, there are some things that, Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. And there's a difference, obviously, between democratic socialism and socialism. it's hard to explain that nuance to a generation of people who grew up being inculcated with a fear of socialism and a fear of communism. Most people probably couldn't tell you the differences between socialism, communism, and fascism. I mean, they don't know the difference as far as they're concerned. Yeah. It's not American. That's all they know. Yeah. Right.
Not American, and they just have statistics of bodies being piled up.
Yeah, totally. But I think for me, the difference is in what I said earlier and what you touched on, which is it's a difference between providing an equality of access and opportunity and orchestrating an equality of outcomes, which is impossible. Yeah. You know what I mean? But I'll use like stock car racing or the NFL as an example versus other sports. So stock car racing, everybody gets to build their own car, but they have to be built within very thinly defined parameters. And then it's up to the technique and skill of the person operating the vehicle and the people maintaining the vehicle to determine who wins. Yeah. And obviously there are some people who are better than others because some people win consistently and other people don't. So if you give everybody an equality of standards and access, then the cream is ultimately going to rise to the top. And right now we don't have an equality of standards and access. So the cream isn't rising to the top, except for in the essence of the white people are rising to the top. Yeah. Now I don't want to get all white guilt on anybody, but white privilege is a thing that absolutely 100% exists in our country, and to deny it is a corruption of the American ideal, in my opinion. Now, it doesn't necessarily assert itself in all the ways that people think it asserts itself in, but it's definitely a very real thing. It doesn't mean anybody gave you anything because you're white necessarily. It just means that you get to live in a system that was built by people like you, around the ideas of people like you, for people like you, when people who weren't like you had no input on what the system should look like. So that's really all that white privilege means, is that you already exist in a system that is built to reflect the way that what your culture is. And we could do a whole nother show again on white privilege. So I don't want to get too far off into that. But socialism is actually where things are owned by the state. Like if you go to Cuba and you take a tour on a guy's sailboat, that guy doesn't own that sailboat. Yeah. The state owns the sailboat. And there's not anything that any candidate currently on the left is proposing that trends anywhere close to state ownership of property. Now you can say things like Medicare for all is socialized medicine, and it is to a certain extent, but that's different than socialism. Yeah. Right? Socialized medicine and socialism aren't the same thing. Socialism would be like if every doctor worked for the government. Yeah. Right? And that's not what happens. And Medicare for all doesn't create that. You still have an opportunity to own your own business, to own your own practice, and to create your own model for that practice. But Medicare for all just assures that everybody has access to healthcare when they need it. And we could again do another show on healthcare and health insurance. I don't know where to me, what you were talking about earlier in economic power, the healthcare industry, or really the health insurance industry, is what kept coming to mind as a thing that markets have not been able to solve. Yeah. Because the markets themselves are corrupted in a way that is irredeemable. And the whole model of a health insurance company is to take in as much money as it can from people and then deny them as much care as possible. Yeah. And that's not access to healthcare. So for me, that's where the government can step in and say, listen, this is what you should have access to as an American citizen. It works in this country. It works in that country. And I'm not saying it has to look exactly like it does in Germany or in Britain or in Sweden or whatever. But I think that there are ways where we can have a better equality of access to healthcare. And for me, progressivism is an attempt to move things in that direction where the society has a control over what the markets provide, as opposed to have the market having control over what the society is supposed to be and ultimately looks like. Yeah. So that, and again, I don't want to hammer you for the traditional libertarian, stances.
Yeah.
But like I looked up the Libertarian Party platform a couple of weeks ago. I have another friend. She was going to Australia to speak at a libertarian conference.
Okay.
And she and I were having a debate over dinner. And so the next day I looked up the Libertarian Party platform, and it's literally markets will fix everything.
Yeah.
It's like their stance on climate change. The markets will get to it. And I'm like, no, that's not good enough for me. Like, I'm not willing to wait around for the markets to determine what the best solution is. Yeah. We have to do something.
And that's one of those things where, they probably are right in like a several decades type look at things.
Yeah, in the long run.
Eventually technology and whatever alternatives will become affordable enough to replace
Right,
whatever.
But again, it's a place where what we talked about earlier, where the markets are corrupted by the people who have the most power now. So like, I mean, Jimmy Carter had solar panels on the White House in the 70s, and Ronald Reagan came in and formed his Energy Commission, which was a bunch of oil executives, and he ripped those fuckers right off.
Yeah.
If we had continued along that line, we wouldn't be in the spot that we are.
Or if we continue with nuclear power.
Totally. Nuclear power. I mean, oil companies can go around and buy up technology that people then aren't allowed to use. So I don't think that the markets are necessarily the best way to solve it's a great way to decide which TV is best.
Yeah.
It's not a great way to decide what access to healthcare people should have.
Yeah. Side note, there's some pretty interesting startups right now that are looking into nuclear power.
Right. I don't necessarily want the market governing nuclear power either. I got to be honest with you.
Because there are things where, like in France, for instance, nuclear power hasn't really been politicized in any way. So it's my understanding that a lot of their technology there is pretty advanced in terms of being able to recycle nuclear waste and yada yada.
Because they've been working on it.
Yeah. Because there was never...
Here we've just been looking for more and more esoteric ways to get a finite resource out of the ground. It's a harder and harder to get at resource that is dwindling.
Blast that rock with a lot of water and get what you need, man.
You don't want to hear the conversations I've had about fracking with my petroleum engineer uncle back in Texas. Doesn't go well.
Yeah, I come from an oil family, so
yeah.
But I mean, that's given nature of the panhandle of Texas, I guess. But yeah. I think that actually lends itself well to if we wanted to get onto the Texas, California.
Yeah, I'm about ready to jump into that.
But there's like two things that really come to mind with Texas and California, and one is the bullet train that I know we're at a early state in. I don't know if you've read about the bullet train that's being proposed from Dallas to Houston.
I haven't, no, actually.
Oh, okay. So it's going to be a private entity doing it, partnering with some of the bullet train companies in Japan to take what they're using there and build a bullet train between Dallas and Houston. And I was trying to pull it up while you were talking earlier but I have too many tabs open. Which means I have no tabs open.
Is it 147? Because I think that's how many tabs are open in my browser right now.
But it's going to basically, they're estimating it'll be, I know it's somewhere less than $5 billion. But private companies are coming into it. I'm sure there's probably, given that it's Texas, I imagine there's going to be some sort of tax subsidies or something that's encouraging them to do this. I don't know for sure, though.
Not a fan of tax subsidies, but...
But so they're building this bullet train, and I'm curious to see how. I think it's supposed to start in 2020, like breaking ground. And I'm curious to see how a bullet train in Texas happens or doesn't happen compared to
how it's not happened in California.
Yeah, like our kind of epic boondoggle we've had in California for the last decade or so, which is also one of those things, like a couple different things in California where most of the money has been spent in acquiring land exorbitant rates and to just building committees to figure out what they need to do.
Sure.
To building committees to figure out which committees need to be built to figure out what they need to do. But yeah, and I'm not sure where we're at in the price of the current bullet train.
It's like the $10 or $12 billion range.
Yeah. But yeah.
No way the train in Texas ends up costing $5 billion either. It's going to, I mean, I suppose the train in California would be long. It's San Francisco to LA-ish. Not exactly, but ish.
Yeah.
That's longer than Dallas to Houston. So it's a bigger train, different terrain, and more expensive land.
Yeah.
Right. So
definitely more expensive
also land. In California, we don't exercise eminent domain the same way they would in Texas.
Yeah.
Which is a weird, to me, cognitive dissonance within the conservative ideal, which is where you just, when the government wants land, they're just going to go in and take it.
Yeah.
And in California, we don't do that. I mean, it's not that we don't do it ever, but certainly not as much. And also it just, there have been a lot of complications with the bullet train. I'd say the biggest complications are that California is a more purple state than people think.
Yeah.
And so the levers of power are gradually moving from one direction to the other, where there are actually more things move a little bit further to the right. It's always on the left-hand side, but there are most of the counties in California are red counties.
Yeah.
If you really look at the counties.
Like, I'd say
nobody lives there.
Yeah. Looking at California is pretty similar to looking at a map of the United States, where like 80% of the actual land is red.
Yeah. And you look at a map of Texas, it's almost exactly the same. It's red everywhere except for the cities, which are more purpley trending towards blue. And then the coastline of Texas, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that'd be an interesting discussion to have. We don't need to get too far into the bullet trains.
Yeah.
We need one. It would be my assessment. But I do want to sort of move over into
or some hyperloops from Elon Musk and company.
Totally. Yeah. Just put your car underground and it comes up in LA and it comes up in San Francisco. That'd be great.
Oh man.
But let's talk a little bit more about the differences between Texas and California as far as governments and culture and how that actually affects your life. Now, as I was getting started thinking about this podcast and, originally the impetus was just Texas versus California. And then when I decided to have you on, it became a little bit more about libertarianism versus progressivism, which, is a fun discussion. But like, I did start doing some research about Texas versus California.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I noticed when I started Googling like Texas versus California, and reading different articles and doing some information gathering is that
lots of fluff pieces.
There's a lot of fluff pieces. Yes, from Texas. Yes. Yeah. This rivalry is incredibly important to Texas. And it's not at all important to California. Like, we don't care. Like, and I think there's a variety, like, living in California, we are very proud of being in California, and we're proud of some of the things that our state does and the culture that we have and some of those things. But we don't ever say, oh, but those Texans over there. We don't ever think about it being necessarily different someplace else. Whereas in Texas,
except Florida.
Yeah. In Texas, and tell me if this was your experience growing up. I know you grew up actually on the border of Texas and Oklahoma in a city actually called Texahoma.
No, Texhoma.
Oh, Texhoma, right.
Screw Texahoma. That place sucks.
That place sucks. Texhoma. Right. I apologize for defaming you. But growing up in Texas, you're constantly being fed this almost a patriotism about being in Texas. Like, it's a very prideful thing that you're expected to express almost at all times. There are Texas flags on everybody's back window. You've got Texas belt buckles. Everybody has Texas on their shirt.
Even more extreme lately because you look at any truck or motorcycle company and they have the Texas edition,
right?
Of
Texans,
everything.
They just really like to think of themselves as not just special or different, but better.
We're the Israel,
right? Absolutely, we are the chosen people, and it's not like that in California. Like you see all of these pieces about Texas versus California and which economy is better and who's doing this better and what's the right way to do things and what's the right way to live. And I would say 90% of that is driven by the Texas side of that equation. Whereas over here in California, we're just like, fuck it, we're living good, we're doing our thing. Why do we're not worried about it? And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. And one of them was what I mentioned earlier with just as you grow up in Texas, you're inculcated with that belief of Texas as this prideful, perfect place.
We're the master state.
And then also, I think it has a lot to do with what we talked about earlier with the way that the Republicans and conservatives have approached their base in the last 30 years, which is conservatives need to generate a foil and give their base an enemy to rail against. And for a lot of conservatives, that idea has been those hippies out there in California, you know.
The hippies in California, the gangs in California.
The failing economy in California, basically a failed state, they call us. But,
and
now it's definitely still an interesting conversation, you know. But again, it's not something that we ever think about in California. Whereas back in Texas, like I used to go, like shortly after I moved here, I've been here, almost 14 years now. And, I would go back to Texas early on and sitting down at a table with people that I'd gone to high school with, are those hippies brainwashing you out there in California? Like these were actual conversations. And as I started gradually becoming more comfortable in expressing my progressive ideals and pushing back against some of the conversations that were being had, you know, railing against the Clintons or Obama or that Muslim or this or that, I'd bringing things up, people would be like, oh, you know, you've really changed since you moved to California. And I'm like, no, that's, you know, I'm not different since I've made a home in California. Like I found a home in California because I'm different. You know, I didn't think the way everybody else here seems to think. And I didn't find a lot of freedom or room to express the way that I do think here. And I mean, even beyond that, I mean, I think we'll get a little bit more into some of the culture and whatnot in a minute, but I'd say you can look at a lot of root economic data and factors for comparison. And for the most part, to me, it all seems to sort of come out in the wash.
Yeah. That's,
you know,
that's my kind of take because it all looks, again, one of my other 9 to 5 type jobs that keeps paying the bills between writing projects is I basically just tell stories with data for I guess I can say, but for the Hallmark Corporation, like their online divisions. And the one thing I've learned is you can definitely look at the same set of numbers and tell any number of stories.
It's like statistics.
Yeah.
Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah, like if the actual numbers don't seem that impressive, kick it over to a percentage and see what happens. Yeah. If the percentage doesn't seem that impressive, vice versa, and just cherry picking whatever. And same, a lot of the stuff I look at between the two states is pretty similar. Like I think one of them that's popped up is one poverty rate versus I forget what it's called, but poverty rate including the cost of living.
Right.
Because
California's going to be higher.
Yeah, so one of those, like California, when it comes to just like poverty rate, is in the top 20 states in terms of it being low.
Right.
But it's pretty up there in terms of having low poverty. But when you
versus cost of living,
then all of a sudden it's literally the bottom of the barrel.
Right. That's the markets at work, though. More people want to be here, so things are more expensive.
Like more, and likewise, like we're kind of having that middle class flight in California too.
I want to address that in a minute, but yeah.
But two states like Texas, Colorado, and I see Oregon a lot, which I think is interesting.
They have more land.
Yeah, they just have more land.
It's a bigger part of that than anything.
Yeah. And it's, and I've also been curious there to see the details of what parts of California
are quote unquote fleeing.
Yeah. And I know LA last year, for the first time in its history, had like more people leave than came in.
Right.
But
LA proper,
but part of that
good. To be honest with you, good. There are too many fucking people here.
Too many people in the Ubers and traffic.
Yeah,
and
405 is a nightmare.
But part of that is them moving. I feel like we saw this in the 90s a lot in the Inland Empire, as we had a boom of people going to Riverside, San Bernardino counties.
You're moving out of the places where homes are prohibitively expensive to the places where you can afford them. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, pretty straightforward. And I kind of feel like that's going to become, it's my own conjecture, but with the way that telecommuting works and the fact that you can work from anywhere.
Yeah.
I know we employ hundreds of people that work remotely, and we never have to, interact with them in a physical presence at all. And
ultimately it's going to come down to what culture do you want to be a part of more than anything, which for me, I enjoy LA not because of necessarily an economic philosophy, but because of a cultural philosophy. And I feel at home. And I think that, there are some very different approaches and very different outcomes, of different metrics that tend to go back and forth between Texas and California. Like 1 year, Texas unemployment rate is better. 1 year, California's is better. It's a constant shift for who you would say is quote unquote winning. Yeah. Although I'd say, in my opinion, on the whole, California more consistently comes out as the more powerful state economy, but mostly you'll end up looking at its differences in approaches and ideology of how you think, not just a government's supposed to run, but what a society is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
And for me, that comes down to the differences in culture with the regulatory environment and taxation, et cetera, sort of being derivative of that cultural philosophy as opposed to necessarily the other way around. And I think that for me, it's the culture of California that I find most attractive, but that culture also includes trying to take care of people as opposed to what I felt in Texas, which was, hey, you're on your own. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, in California, we try, I'm not saying we're always successful or that the method that we try is always the best method, but we try to lift people up and provide a higher quality of access. Now, there are, in my opinion, corruptions to those efforts that come mostly from the market. So I think there are ways that the government can corrupt the markets, and then there are ways that the markets can corrupt the efforts of the government that they need to be doing. And it's that mixed form of government that you're talking about. It's always going to be a constant back and forth play of, can we do a little bit more of this while protecting that? And there's going to be winners and losers, and no matter what you do, there's going to be winners and losers. But to me, it's a determination of whether or not the people in power are always the winners versus whether or not those people who need to be lifted up are constantly always the losers.
Yeah. And then California, talk about lifting people up. You get into the territory that is, I feel, probably just like a Fox News punching back at this point is like our homeless crisis that we have here. And this is one of the things that when I was running, I was doing some deeper dives into. But like the homeless crisis that we have, we basically, our homeless population since 2010 through, I think, 2017 or 18 doubled in Los Angeles. I don't know about California as a whole.
Right.
And at that same time, we had our rent in Los Angeles, at least, and I think California is pretty similar, but go up from an average of like $1,500 a month for like I think it's a 1-bedroom, to now, I just checked, and the average is like $2,500 a month for a 1-bedroom.
It's insane.
And then you look into the homeless population that we have, and this is going off LA County's count, but roughly 50% of the people that are homeless for less than 3 months. So it's people that literally just can't afford to live someplace for a short period of time.
They were living paycheck to paycheck. They lost a job.
Exactly.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah. So that's, to me, like the one thing that you can target as something in that debate.
Well, I mean, the Republicans, Trump specifically, are certainly trying to target that, right? I mean, he's more focused on San Francisco. But I think that definitely housing in California has become a problem in a variety of ways. I mean, the fastest growing population of homeless people in Los Angeles County make between $60,000 and $100,000 a year. That's insane. That's pretty crazy that you make between $60,000 and $100,000 a year, and you might not be able to afford some place to live.
And I feel I'm definitely in that boat where I'm in that sort of income range, and I still feel like
it's tough to find some place.
Every month at the end, I'm like, oh man, I'm really counting these pennies. Am I going to
get there? Yeah. I think that there's a lot going on there. Part of it, to me, it's a failing of the regulatory environment. I mean, I used to think rent control was a great idea. I listened to a couple of podcasts and I've done a lot of research lately. It tends not to work.
Yeah. And
that doesn't mean that it can't work. It's just the way that we implement it is bad.
I'd be curious to know, because that's another thing. When I was running, I read a bunch of studies on rent control that all came out inconclusive.
Right.
Like everyone I read was... But logically, it makes sense to me that it's how it's implemented. But if you're guaranteeing, I forget what we just passed that recently in California, but if you're guaranteeing that X amount of units are going to be low income, which is different than rent control.
Different, yeah.
Yeah. But rent control, you're guaranteeing it's not going to go for X percentage unless, but what ends up happening is newer properties, or the properties that are open,
and they drive the market.
Yeah,
ultimately,
those have to be more expensive.
If everything that you're building is a new luxury home and it's costing $3,000 for a one bedroom, then even those homes that aren't renovated in luxury, it's going to raise the price of those homes.
And then. You have...
And rent control specifically, people end up staying in a location for longer, which depresses the inventory.
Exactly.
And we have too many in California. This is another problem that's adding to it, because we have a limited amount of land. In Texas, it wouldn't be a problem. Mm-hmm. But in California...
we have... Plenty of land, but no one wants to live.
No one wants to live in the desert, right? They all want to live as close to the coast as you can get.
They don't want to live in Death Valley.
Yeah.
They don't actually want to live in Big Bear.
Yeah, but we have too much that's zoned for single-family housing.
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible to change it because of the politics of coming in and telling people, okay, now that lot across the street is going to be a fourplex.
The not in my backyard thing.
The NIMBY thing, which also relates back to the nuclear power thing, which relates back to my comment earlier about human nature, which is... Humans are going to trend towards bias towards their own circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's why you need a government that comes in and says, no, this is what has to happen. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think that the housing is a huge issue in California. It's something, and to me, the biggest problem is the Airbnb stuff, the short-term rentals. Nayoon and I, my wife, we just moved out of an 8-unit rent-controlled building. And by the time we moved out, 4 of those units were illegally being rented as short-term housing, which depresses the limited effectiveness of rent control.
Yeah.
Because now you're taking rent-controlled units off the market. Yeah. And I think I read recently something like 12,000 units in LA are off the market because they're being utilized for short-term rentals. Yeah. And then everything that the city wants to build is luxury housing or big hotels.
Yeah.
And we don't need hotels. We don't fucking need hotels. We need places for people to live.
And so, that's the thing is it's a very direct example of how it's hard to have quote unquote free market, but like have some direct capitalism and the Airbnb coexisting next to the government, or this point, the state and city government,
right,
regulating something, because capitalism is going to find a way to exploit whatever it can.
Yeah.
And this is, like, I have a few friends that, the other thing, quick aside, that I Schadenfreude enjoy is I know lots of white liberals that have gone in and kind of gentrified these areas and taken advantage of the
low housing costs,
housing costs, and then like just hang on to those and then turn around and like Airbnb them.
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, I mean, this is worth twice what I'm paying, and I've been here for 20 years, so, I'm just going to go get a place in the valley that's cheap and just like, yeah.
And I should play, I'm a gig economy guy.
Yeah.
We didn't get into and we don't really have time, but the recent California regulations on Uber and those sorts of companies, I don't like them. But we can maybe have another conversation about that. But I'm a fan of Airbnb. I think there's a place for it, but it's not meant to have people buying up apartment buildings and turning those apartment buildings into hotels. That's not the way that it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
So I think we're pretty close to being able to wrap things up, but you touched on something earlier, and it goes back to the middle class flight from California.
Yeah.
Like one of the first things that I saw when I started researching, and it was actually one of the things that drove the impetus for wanting to have this podcast about Texas versus California, which it turned into not being as much about. But
we didn't even get to how the streets are covered in shit, or how
totally there's trash everywhere.
How our taxes are insane in California, but the roads suck. But in Texas, they're all great.
There's no homelessness or trash on the streets in Houston at all. It's all in San Francisco. But one of the big things that
Houston.
It was about 6 months ago, there was a ton of talk about people, quote unquote, fleeing California for states like Texas and whatever. So I started doing some of the research, and you mentioned it a while ago, but over the last 10 years, there's been a net migration loss of 1 million people from California to states like Texas, which sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
But it's 0.025% of the population. And the population of California has continued to grow in that time frame. So it's not like we're losing people. And most of the people who are losing are not actually middle-class people. They're people on the lower end of the spectrum who just can't afford to live here anymore, which is a problem because I believe in a capitalist economy, but a capitalist economy needs all three tiers. But the problem is that we have all three tiers and we treat one tier like they're the scum of the earth, and we don't recognize them as an equal functioning member of the three tiers of capitalism.
Yeah.
And then one of the articles I saw was in 2017, we had a net migration, loss for net domestic migration, which the Census Bureau has all of these different statistics, but it was 138,000 people in 2017.
Yeah.
And that's 0.003% of the population. So it's not like I see these articles where people are fleeing California. And those, again, that goes back to this rivalry being driven mostly by people in Texas who are using this hyperbolic language to pump themselves up. Like it's my
not
opinion,
the white flight that Detroit saw in the 70s.
Not anything like that. And in 2018, the year after we saw that 138,000 number, which was the most we'd seen, the per capita GDP in California was still 20% higher than the per capita GDP in Texas. So it's not like we're losing economic power. I mean, California over the last 10 years has actually moved from the 6th largest economy in the world to the 5th largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're losing economic power. We definitely have some issues that we need to address, but so would Texas, and so would New York or Florida. I mean, definitely Florida.
Yeah. And
definitely states like Kansas or Oklahoma. But the bottom line is that California is still an incredibly powerful economy, growing in economic power, and it's by far the largest net contributor to national GDP and to the coffers of the federal government, which then distributes that money back out to states, not like Texas because it's also a net contributor, but almost entirely red states, you know, Oklahomas and the Kansases and the Iowas and the Montanas and those sorts of places that wouldn't be able to subsist on their own.
Yeah.
And this is, I want to get this thought experiment in because it was one of the things that I was thinking about when it was this podcast was intended to be driven mostly by Texas versus California. But somebody tweeted, I think it was Joe Walsh, who used to be a Republican congressman. He was a Tea Party congressman. He's now running for president against Trump. In what seems like a failed attempt, but
Bill Weld.
In Sanford, the guy from South Carolina who, the Appalachian Trail guy.
I didn't even hear about that.
So I actually made a comment on Facebook earlier, like, these guys aren't going. People were like, these guys aren't going anywhere. I was like, I don't know, like 3 months from now, these guys could all be in an open race for the.
Side note, you
don't know.
Bovada, I have been bugging them like every week for a while because I'm like,
give me odds on those. Yeah,
they won't even give odds on those guys, even though they're giving odds.
Yeah, well, if you wanted odds, you wouldn't want to take odds on those guys. You'd want to take odds on like Jeb Bush or the people who are going to jump into the race if Trump actually resigns, which I don't know if he will or not. But
yeah, those are the odds I want.
Yeah, totally. You want them now.
Yeah, I want like this
3,000 to 1 odds.
1,000 to 1 odds on Bill Weld to be
president. You bet $10 on it and you're good. But I was thinking about a thought experiment about, I think that, number one, if California separated from the rest of the union, it's an economy that would be able to subsist on its own. And I don't think you can say that about any other state in the union. But the thought experiment really came from something Joe Walsh said, which was, if you were to go about constructing the United States now, there's no way you'd construct it in the form that it is. It would probably be 4 or 5 completely different countries.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, let's think about that. Let's say we're going to make 4 countries out of the current United States.
Yeah.
And we're going to take the 4 largest economies, which is California, Texas, New York, and Florida.
Yeah.
And we're going to make each of those 4 states an anchor state for one of the new countries.
Yeah.
And then when you start thinking about, okay, which other states are going to come with California, which are going to go with Florida, which are going to go with Texas, and which are going to go with New York. In the end, I think you end up with, you have to think about aligning ideologies and aligning geography and those sorts of things. And I think in the end, you end up with 2 viable countries.
Yeah.
And that's the country rooted in New York and the country rooted in California, and 2 countries that are going to fail miserably. And that's the country rooted in Texas and the country rooted in Florida. Because the economies just are not, I mean, California and New York as 2 states make up close to 25% of the total GDP for the United States.
Yeah.
You take those 2 out and make them their own countries, and then Texas also gets Oregon and Washington State and probably Nevada, and just that is an economically viable country. Whereas Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska, that shit fails inside of 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily a proving point of a more liberal philosophy versus a more conservative philosophy.
Yeah.
It's just a point about the idea that, in my mind, if there's a rivalry between California and Texas, California economically is a more economically viable country than Texas would be.
Yeah, and I guess with that, you're going with the idea that trade is ceasing between these countries.
Well, you'd have to come to some level of trade agreements.
Yeah.
Right, but
because you'd also have, like, it's my understanding, unless things have changed very recently, California doesn't have enough water for itself. So we are purchasing water from Colorado and Nevada and bringing that in constantly.
Yeah, but is Colorado going to be a part of Texas, or is it going to be a part of California? Ideologically, I would suggest...
Sounds like we got ourselves a war.
Yeah, totally. It's an interesting thought experiment. It's fun. It doesn't actually mean anything, but I think that if Colorado had a choice to go with either Texas or California, they're going to vote as a population to go with California. because they also then get Washington and Oregon and probably Nevada. Does New Mexico even go with Texas? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was just, I realized we're not being very contrary and driving a lot of conflict between Texas and California between us, because we're both sort of, pragmatic about it in a lot of senses, and that it all it's just different philosophies, but ultimately it all comes out in the wash. But I think that,
how much oil does California still? I know LA still makes.
Yeah, we produce quite a bit.
Quite a bit
California
of oil.
California does, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not our number one economy the way it is in Texas.
Yeah.
But
those sort of
we have enough to sustain ourselves.
So those sort of things I'd be very curious to see, like when we talk GDP, what the actual breakdown is of the different industries. Because obviously California, a huge portion that we're talking about with that is Silicon Valley. And
a lot of it, but we do a lot of manufacturing. We do a lot of farming.
Yeah, a lot of farming.
So, I mean, California can sustain itself. Texas could sustain itself to a certain extent. But if Texas had to take on Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and Louisiana, those states are very, very, very far from sustaining themselves.
Yeah.
And they'd be a huge drag on Texas, whereas California would be taking on Nevada and Washington State and Oregon, all of which are currently sustaining themselves, and they're all net givers as opposed to net takers.
Yeah. I want to see this play out.
Let's make it happen.
Let's do it.
We should write an alternate universe show where this is this is what's going on.
That, and I desperately want to see the California split into multiple states.
Yeah, but ultimately that gives the left more senators than...
Yeah, it does.
It does, yeah. I mean, it's not a bad plan.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I'd like to see the Constitution completely rewritten to address some of the inequities in the Senate and the Electoral College and those sorts of things. But because technically in California, my vote counts far less than the vote of somebody in Montana. Alabama.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been fun.
Cool.
I appreciate you coming by, and maybe we can do this sometime again. We ran a little bit longer than I wanted to, but it's been a delightful conversation.
Likewise, yeah.
And I hope people will check out the show that you did, Day 5.
Day 5. It's on the El Rey Network.
El Rey Network, and you can probably find it. Just Google it.
Yeah.
Google it. That's the way you find anything.
Put show at the end. Otherwise, you'll just get Day 5 of the week.
Which day is that? Does it start with Sunday or Monday?
I think they start with Sunday.
Sunday. All right, so is that Friday? Thursday?
It's going to be Thursday.
Yeah. And for those of you interested in discussions about what's going on with Trump's impeachment, please stay tuned for another podcast coming with Rick and Michael and myself, and we will certainly dissect that to your delight. Thanks for joining the Left Crew Politics podcast, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of our Left Crew Politics podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Left Crew Politic. Follow the Facebook page at facebook.com/leftcrewpolitics and the LCP website, leftcrewpolitics.com. Search for our channel on YouTube, iTunes, and Google Play.
Without care, I was out of